Hello and welcome to A Bit Too Much to Think. Today is the seventh episode in a series on sovereign citizens. Now, if you're not familiar with sovereign citizens, they're essentially a group of people that pick and choose which laws to follow, and they give really weird reasons for why they want to break the law. Now, in many cases, they use weird, random, piecemeal case law to support their beliefs, but in this case, I'm talking about people that say, I don't follow the laws of man, I only follow the laws of God. Now, I've seen quite a few people say this. I've seen specific, local news reports about people that hold this belief that they specifically say, I follow God's law, not man's law. And so, my goal here is to look at some theology, specifically Christian theology, because that's the one that most of these people subscribe to, and show why that's actually a ridiculous argument from their own point of view. Now, look, you can agree or disagree with any theology that you want. You're more than welcome to do that, but if I'm arguing that they're wrong from their own position, then they're blatantly wrong. I also should preface this with that I come from a background of being a practicing Christian, but it's kind of irrelevant because I'm looking at a lot of different places for this idea. So, I look at several different Bible verses, and then I look at three different theologians' writings, major theologians, to figure out whether or not, there is any theological backing for following only God's law instead of following the law of man. So, let's look at it. So the very first thing that I think is worth pointing out is there's a verse that is in actually the first three books of the Bible. So it's Mark 12:17, Luke 25:20, and Matthew 22:21. And it says, it's Jesus saying, give to Caesar what is Caesar's and give to the Lord what is the Lord's. Now, this is very commonly quoted as something that is, basically saying, pay your taxes, obey the law. It's not a big deal. And it's also kind of separating Christianity from politics. That's how it's commonly viewed. But I want to give a little bit of a theological examination into it, because really what Jesus is getting at here is that things of the world, like material wealth, belong to the world, not to God. He's essentially getting people to look at the world a different way. Money is meaningless to God, and what matters to God is us and who we are. Now, although material wealth is useful for helping other people, such as, buying them clothes or giving them money so that they can buy food, this passage really focuses on wealth as being a part of this world and not really important. That really is the summing up of that. So I'm not sure that this verse really disproves that you can only follow God's law and not man's law, but I want to talk about a verse that's commonly quoted to support that argument, which is Acts 5:21, where the apostles say we must obey God rather than human beings. Now, when you just listen to that single verse, you might think, oh, well, it's from the book of Acts, so it's in the Bible. That must mean that you don't have to follow human beings, you only obey God. Well, it's important to put some context to this, because what's happening is the apostles are put into jail after being ordered to stop preaching about God. An angel comes and opens the jail cell, and they continue preaching as before. When brought before essentially a hearing, they say this line, we must obey God rather than human beings. And what it really means is they have to listen to what God told them, and they need to preach the gospel, rather than listening to people telling them to shut up about it. So in a way, what they're really saying is that they're not obeying laws that defy their God-given purpose. They're not at all saying that any Christian cannot abide by any man-made laws. So, unless having license plates really is preventing you from spreading the word of God, which, here's a hint, it's not, and unless God sent holy fire down upon you, told you to spread the word of Jesus Christ, who you knew in person, here's a hint, that didn't happen to you because you never met the living God in your life because he ascended to heaven about 2,000 years ago, you can't violate driver's laws. Having a driver's license does not impede on any God-given purpose or law. There is no law that really impedes on God-given purpose in that way. So that's a few Bible verses that are important to discuss. But I also want to look at some theologians and how they look at law. So I'm starting off with St. Thomas Aquinas. Now, he analyzes law on a big scale. Not necessarily made just by people, but kind of law in general, like an overarching idea, and then he boils down to human-made law. I also have to preface this with that I am boiling down the Summa Theologica, probably the most complete and thorough examination of theology and reason that has ever existed, into like a minute or two for a basic understanding of human law through a theological perspective, so I am simplifying and leaving things out for the sake of brevity. Now, St. Thomas Aquinas, in his argument about law in the Summa Theologica, question 90, article 2, is as follows. He says, "The last end of human life is bliss or happiness. Consequently, the law must needs regard principally the relationship to happiness." So, basically, the law has to relate to happiness in some way. So then he splits his law into 3 different places. The first is eternal law, which is the thing from which all laws get their being. It's essentially like the divine orders of God to the earth. The second form is natural law, which is, and this is a quote from him, "the participation of the eternal law in the rational creature." And this is basically how we can know right from wrong and know to do good instead of evil. But the final is human law, which employ our reasoning to use natural law to govern specific actions, items, and events. The important thing here is that Aquinas says in question 96 of the Summa Theologica, and this is a quote, "Human laws should be proportionate to the common good." And when speaking of unjust laws, he says, "Laws may be unjust in 2 ways. First, by being contrary to human good, which Aquinas writes is, quote, when a man makes a law that goes beyond the power committed to him or in respect of the form, as when burdens are imposed unequally on the community, although with a view to the common good." The other form of an unjust law Aquinas mentions is when they are opposed to the divine good, such as being forced to, worship an idol. Now, this is really important because God never says that we have some kind of divine right to drive or travel without a license or do whatever you want. Now, the Founding Fathers believed we have the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness given to us by God, and I would tend to agree with that view. But as much as the DMV sucks, getting a license to drive does not impede on those 3 things. Having to register your car does not impede on those 3 things. In fact, laws like that certainly contribute to the common good, which Aquinas talked about, because showing competency in safely operating a machine capable of serious damage and death like a car is well within the common good of all people. So that's some Catholic theology, and that really is the basis of a lot of modern theological thought. But let's look at some Protestant theology. There's 2 really important theologians that are worth discussing. So the first one is John Calvin, and then I'm going to look at Martin Luther. So first, John Calvin. So John Calvin wrote the Institutes of the Christian Religion, which is another really long examination of theology. I have to boil down to a minute of law talk. So again, I'm leaving things out for the sake of brevity. I'm taking most of this from chapter 7 of this writing, where Calvin sets forth 3 uses of law. First, it works as like a mirror to show us our own sin and understand the negative effects of it, because the worse the crime, the worse the punishment. The second use of law is to curb the selfish, evil people from doing bad for fear of the consequences. And the third use of law is that it pushes people that God has blessed into the path of righteousness. So in here, there's nothing about not following man's law, and he even argues that man's law has an expressly good purpose. It not only keeps evil people from doing bad, but it pushes good people into the path of righteousness, according to Calvin. And it helps us to understand and see our own sin. So it actually has a good purpose, according to Calvin. So finally, I'm looking at Martin Luther here. Now, Luther has a rather dim view of humanity. I mean, to be fair, so does Calvin. But he famously views life on earth and life in heaven as 2 separate, in his word, kingdoms. Now, there's a really good scholarly article that I am citing to quote Luther here, because it also boils down a massive number of theological writings into a focused subject. It is called Between Sanctity and Depravity, Law and Human Nature and Martin Luther's 2 Kingdoms, and it's by Witt Jr. Now, what the author points out is that Luther believed that the earthly kingdom is ruled by law, which is completely different from God's authority. As Luther sees it, law is a chain that constrains the savage beast that is mankind. Now, the author of this article points out that it's easy to see, based on this dim view of life on earth and some other choices of writing, why people based on Luther might turn away from earthly law altogether, which is funny because that's the exact issue this episode addresses. But that's more of Luther's early writings. Later, he does expand his thoughts on law. Essentially, he writes that the natural order of the world creates three orders or governments in the kingdom on earth. These are the household, the state, and the church. These comprise a different dimension of God's authority on earth. In the words of Luther, quote, God wants the government of the earthly kingdom to be a symbol of the heavenly kingdom. So, according to Luther, government is an extension of God insofar as it fulfills his purpose. Therefore, human law contributes to God's purpose for the earth. So again, that's the third theologian, one of the major theologians of Christianity as a whole. Luther doesn't necessarily influence every single group, but that's a third theologian that says, look, it's okay to follow human law. You don't have to just follow God's law. And I think it's really important to note at the end here, among all of these passages and theologians, none of them say to never follow the law that governments impose. In fact, all three theologians argue that there is an important purpose to man-made law. Now, it's also worth noting that we discussed unjust laws with St. Thomas Aquinas, and Calvin and Luther basically have the same view of unjust laws as Aquinas. And it's important to note that completely unjust laws, so for example, like I said before, being forced to worship like a golden calf by the king, that's not only an unjust law, but that's a law that violates the divine good, according to Aquinas. And so those laws, under Christian thought, do not technically have to be followed, and shouldn't be followed in the case of, having to believe in some heresy like that. But the important thing here is, none of the laws that all of these sovereign citizens are breaking fall anywhere near any kind of heretical law, like having to worship a golden calf, or having to worship a king, or something like that. Having to pay taxes is not an unjust thing. Christ says, give to Caesar what is Caesar, give to the Lord what is the Lord's, because material wealth really doesn't matter to God. It doesn't matter at all, really, except when it can be used to do good. But that's kind of an entirely separate thing about taxation that's worth discussing another time. I know I keep bringing up, getting a driver's license and registering your vehicle specifically because, I've seen a local news story about a guy who keeps getting arrested because he keeps saying that, he has the right to travel and he only follows God's law. And I think it's important that we understand none of these laws really violate this principle of being an unjust law. You have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but having to pay taxes, having to register your vehicle, having to follow, basic bureaucratic standards does not violate that at all. And honestly, if it did, the Supreme Court would have ruled against it already. So that is a really long summation of tons of theological evidence that following man's law does not violate God's law. It's okay to follow man's law. Thank you very much for listening to this episode of A Bit Too Much to Think. If you liked it, leave a like. If you want to see more, subscribe. If you have any more thoughts on the subject, go ahead and leave a comment. But I know we're talking about religions, so let's try to be relatively respectful in the comments section. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you have a wonderful day.